A luxury car screeches to a halt. A pregnant woman is thrown onto rain-soaked pavement and abandoned. Her husband speeds away, leaving her with nothing, no phone, no money, no hope. But what he doesn't know is that she's recording every word of his betrayal. And the inheritance he's trying to steal, it's worth $2.4 billion. This is the story of a woman who refused to disappear, a courtroom battle that exposed years of calculated lies, and a twist ending that proves the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate someone you've pushed too far. Before we begin, hit that like button and drop a comment telling us where you're listening from. Your support keeps these stories coming. Now, let's dive into Grace's fight for justice. 3 days before the storm, Grace woke in their penthouse on Lakeshore Drive to find Derek already dressed for work, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Lake Michigan. The morning sun painted the water gold, but the light never seemed to reach their bedroom. "Good morning," she said softly. Sitting up carefully, at 7 months pregnant, every movement required thought. Derek turned, his expression neutral. "I've taken your laptop to my office. You need to rest, not strain your eyes with screens." Grace's stomach tightened. "I was just reading articles about preparing for the baby. Nothing strenuous." "Doctor's orders," Derek said, straightening his tie. "Too much screen time raises blood pressure. I'm thinking of your health, of our daughter's health." It was not a conversation. It was an announcement. After he left, Grace tried to remember when his protectiveness had shifted into something else, something that felt less like care and more like control. She walked through the penthouse, a space that should have felt like home, but instead felt like a museum where she was the exhibit. Her phone rang. An unknown number. She answered quickly. "Grace, it's Claire. I've been trying to reach you for months. Are you okay?" Claire, her best friend from Northwestern University, where Grace had studied art history before Derek convinced her to drop out. They had not spoken in 8 months. "Claire, I'm sorry. I've been meaning to call. It's just that Derek thinks what, Grace? This isn't you. You disappeared. No one's heard from you. I called your dad, and even he said Derek told him you needed space from family." Grace's throat tightened. "He said that, are you safe? Do you need help?" Before Grace could answer, she heard the penthouse door open. Derek's voice called out, "Grace, who are you talking to?" "I have to go," Grace whispered and ended the call. Derek appeared in the doorway, his expression sharp. "Who was that? Wrong number." His eyes searched her face, looking for lies. Then he smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Come, let's have breakfast. I made reservations at that cafe you like." Later that morning, at the cafe on Michigan Avenue, Grace tried to pay for coffee with her credit card. The machine declined it. "That's strange," she said, trying another card. Also declined. Derek smoothly handed his card to the server. "Probably just a bank error. I'll call them." But Grace noticed something in his expression, the smallest flicker of satisfaction. That afternoon, while Derek was supposedly at work, Grace searched for her mother's heirloom necklace, a silver locket her mother had worn every day before she died. Grace kept it in a velvet box in her jewelry drawer. The box was empty. She searched the entire bedroom, growing frantic. When Derek came home, she confronted him. "My mother's necklace is missing." Derek frowned. "Honey, you're confused. You told me last week you wanted to get it cleaned. I took it to the jeweler on Oak Street." "I never said that." "You did. You don't remember." His voice was gentle, patronizing. "It's pregnancy brain, completely normal. The doctor warned us about memory issues." Grace wanted to argue, but doubt crept in. Had she forgotten? The past months felt like a blur. That evening, unable to sleep, Grace wandered into Derek's home office, a room she rarely entered. His desk was immaculate, everything filed and organized. She was about to leave when she noticed a folder tucked behind his computer monitor. The label read Montgomery Trust. Montgomery was her maiden name. Her heart pounding, Grace opened the folder. Inside were documents, legal papers, corporate filings. She saw her grandfather's name, Howard Montgomery. Saw her own name listed as beneficiary. Saw numbers that made her vision swim, hundreds of millions of dollars. "What are you doing?" Derek's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Grace spun around, the folder in her hands. This has my name on it. My grandfather's company. What is this? Derek's expression shifted. The mask of the caring husband slipping for just a second. In its place was something cold and calculating. Put that down. Derek, what is Montgomery Trust? Why do you have this? He crossed the room in 3 long strides and took the folder from her hands. These are private business documents and you shouldn't be going through my things. But it has my name. Great. His voice was sharp now. You're tired. You're emotional. This is exactly why I worry about you. He guided her firmly toward the door. Go to bed. We'll discuss this when you're thinking clearly. But Grace noticed something crucial. He had not asked what file she found. He knew exactly which one, which meant he had been expecting this moment. Lying in bed that night, Grace's mind raced. Montgomery Trust. Her grandfather's company. Her name as beneficiary. Why would Derek have those documents? Why would he hide them from her? She thought back to how they met, supposedly by chance at a Starbucks near campus. How quickly he had pursued her. How he had encouraged her to leave school, to depend on him, to trust him completely. How systematically he had cut her off from everyone she knew. The baby kicked hard, as if sensing her mother's distress. Grace placed both hands on her belly and whispered, I'll protect you. Whatever's happening, I'll figure it out. But as she lay in the darkness, listening to Derek's even breathing beside her, Grace felt the first real tremor of fear. Not the fear of being alone, but the fear of realizing she had never truly known the man sleeping next to her. And somewhere in her mind, a terrible question formed. What if her entire marriage had been a lie? Grace could not sleep. The baby kept kicking, pressing against her ribs, as if she too sensed something was wrong. The clock on the nightstand read 2:15 in the morning. Bashida Haro. Derek slept soundly, his breathing deep and even. Then she heard his voice, muffled, coming from downstairs. Derek's office. Grace sat up slowly, careful not to make the bed creak. She reached for her robe and slipped it on, her hands shaking. As she moved toward the bedroom door, she grabbed her phone from the nightstand. The hallway was dark except for the thin line of light beneath Derek's office door. His voice grew clearer as she approached. Once the baby's born, we'll have full custody leverage. Grace froze, her hand on the wall to steady herself. I'm telling you, Vanessa, it's almost over. Grace doesn't know she inherited Montgomery Industries. The old man left everything to her, not her deadbeat father. Montgomery Industries, the folder, her grandfather. Grace's heart hammered so hard she thought it might wake Derek, wherever he was. Then she remembered. He was in the office. The voice was coming from there. With trembling fingers, she opened her phone's voice recorder and pressed record. She held it near the door crack, barely breathing. A woman's voice came through, tinny from speakerphone. How much longer do we have to wait? I'm tired of hiding. After the birth, Derek said. We'll use postpartum depression. Get her commuted to a psychiatric facility. Once she's declared incompetent, I'll have guardianship over her and the assets. Then we can be together publicly. And if she fights, Derek laughed, a sound Grace had never heard from him before, cold and cruel. She won't. I've made sure she has nothing. No money, no friends, no family connections. No one would believe her anyway. Everyone thinks she's fragile, emotional, dependent. I've built that narrative for 2 years. You're sure about the inheritance amount? $2.4 billion. Montgomery Industries owns manufacturing plants across the Midwest. Her grandfather built an empire. And that empire should have gone to someone who could actually run it, not some art history dropout. Grace pressed her fist against her mouth to keep from crying out. 2 years. Their entire marriage. It had all been a lie. What about the baby? Vanessa asked. What about her, Derek, that's your daughter. She's leverage. Once we have custody, Grace won't fight us. She'll sign whatever we want just to keep visitation rights. And if she doesn't cooperate fully, well, we'll make sure those rights disappear too. Grace's knees weakened. She slid down the wall, still holding the phone toward the door, making sure every word was captured. When did you first find out about the Montgomery inheritance? Vanessa asked. 3 years ago. I was working in mergers and acquisitions at the firm. The Montgomery estate came across my desk during probate. The will was sealed, but I have connections. $50,000 to the right clerk, and I had a copy. That's when I saw Grace's name. The old man left everything to his granddaughter, even though they hadn't spoken in 20 years. So you tracked her down. I researched her, found out she was a graduate student at Northwestern, struggling with debt, isolated from family. Perfect target. I engineered the meeting at Starbucks, made it look random, swept her off her feet, got her to trust me, depend on me, need me. You're telling me this entire relationship was calculated. Every single step. Derek's voice was proud. I even timed the proposal. Had to marry her before the 3-year contest period on the will expired. 1 month to spare. Grace wanted to vomit. The proposal on the beach in Nantucket. She thought it was the most romantic moment of her life. He had been watching a countdown. And she never suspected. Vanessa sounded almost impressed. Grace is naive, sheltered. She wanted to believe someone loved her. I gave her that fantasy. Now she's 7 months pregnant, completely dependent, and has no idea what's about to hit her. The recording had been running for 6 minutes. Grace stopped it, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone. She needed to save this, send it somewhere safe. She backed away from the door, moving as quietly as possible toward the guest bathroom at the end of the hall. Once inside, she locked the door and sat on the tile floor, her mind racing. Email. She needed to email this to someone, but who Derek had isolated her so completely. Then she remembered her old university email. She had not checked it in over a year, but it should still be active. It took 3 tries to remember the password. Finally, the account opened. She uploaded the recording to her cloud storage, then forwarded a copy to the email itself with the subject line insurance. Her hands were still shaking as she cleared the sent folder and logged out. A sound in the hallway made her freeze. Footsteps. Grace. Derek's voice was soft, searching. Honey, where are you? Grace flushed the toilet, ran water in the sink, and opened the door. Derek stood in the hallway, wearing his robe, his expression concerned. Are you feeling okay? I woke up and you were gone. Grace forced herself to meet his eyes, to keep her voice steady. Just pregnancy insomnia. The baby won't stop kicking. He moved closer, placing a hand on her belly. The gesture made her skin crawl, but she did not flinch. Our little girl is active tonight. Derek, Grace took a breath. That folder I found, Montgomery Trust. Can we talk about it? His expression hardened slightly. There's nothing to talk about. Those are confidential business documents. But my name was on them. Grace, you're tired. You're reading things that aren't there. Come back to bed. I know what I saw. His hand tightened slightly on her arm. This conversation is over. You're working yourself up over nothing. It's not healthy for the baby. As he guided her back to the bedroom, Grace realized with absolute clarity that she was living with a stranger. A man who had studied her, targeted her, married her, and gotten her pregnant. All for money she never knew existed. And now that stranger knew she was asking questions. She lay in bed beside him, feeling his arm around her, and understood that the countdown had begun. Grace did not sleep for the rest of the night. She lay motionless beside Derek, feeling the weight of his arm across her body like a chain. In her mind, she replayed the recording over and over. Every word burned into her memory. When morning light finally filtered through the curtains, Derek's alarm went off. He silenced it and turned to her. How did you sleep? Fine, Grace lied. He studied her face for a moment, as if trying to read her thoughts. Then he got up and headed to the shower. The moment the bathroom door closed, Grace grabbed her phone. The recording was still in her cloud storage. She downloaded it again, just to be sure. The file played clearly. Derek's voice admitting everything. But now what? Who could she tell? The police, would they even believe her? Derek had connections everywhere. He had spent 2 years building the narrative that she was fragile, dependent, unstable. Grace thought about her options. She needed help, but from someone Derek did not control, someone outside his circle. Claire, her old friend from Northwestern, the one Derek had made sure she stopped talking to. But before Grace could search for Claire's number, Derek emerged from the bathroom. I'm taking the day off, he announced, watching her carefully. I think we need to talk. Grace's stomach dropped. About what? about you going through my private files, about your questions last night, about the fact that you seem to think I'm hiding something from you. He sat on the edge of the bed, his expression unreadable. Grace, I love you. Everything I do is to protect you and our daughter. But I'm worried about your state of mind. My state of mind is fine. Is it you're accusing me of keeping secrets? You're paranoid about business documents that have nothing to do with you. You're not sleeping. He reached for her hand. These are signs of prenatal anxiety. Maybe we should call Dr. Matthews. Dr. Matthews, Derek's psychiatrist friend. I don't need a psychiatrist. Grace, there's no shame in getting help. Pregnancy affects brain chemistry. You're not thinking clearly. Stop saying that. Her voice rose. Stop telling me I'm confused or emotional or not thinking clearly. I know what I saw in that folder. Derek's expression shifted, the concerned husband mask slipping. What exactly do you think you saw? Montgomery Trust, my grandfather's company, documents with my name on them. And what conclusions have you drawn from that? Grace met his eyes. That you've been lying to me about who I am, about what I'm entitled to. The silence stretched between them, dangerous and electric. Then Derek smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You want the truth? Grace, fine. Yes, your grandfather left you Montgomery Industries, worth billions. But you know what? You couldn't run a lemonade stand, let alone a manufacturing empire. You dropped out of school. You have no business experience, no connections, no skills. His words hit like physical blows. I dropped out because you convinced me to. You said we'd build a life together. And we did. I gave you everything. This penthouse, security, a future for our child. All I asked in return was that you trust me to handle the complicated things. But you couldn't even do that. You married me for my inheritance. Derek laughed. I married you because you were easy to manage. And you know what the beautiful part is, no one will believe you. I've spent 2 years making sure everyone thinks you're helpless without me. Your father thinks you're fragile. My friends think you're sheltered. Even your old professors probably don't remember you. Grace felt tears burning her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. You said you loved me. I love what you represent. Access to an empire, a beautiful wife to show off, a daughter to carry on the Montgomery name, which will be Ashford soon enough. Once I have control, I'll fight you. With what? Derek stood, towering over her. You have no money. I control all our accounts. You have no phone records I don't see, no email I don't monitor, no friends you haven't abandoned. You're 7 months pregnant with nowhere to go. Face it, Grace, you're trapped. Something inside Grace snapped, not into despair, but into a clarity she had never felt before. You're right, she said quietly. I don't have money or connections or power, but I have something you don't know about. Derek's expression sharpened. What? Proof, I recorded you last night. You and Vanessa planning how to steal my inheritance, how to have me committed, how to use our daughter as leverage. For the first time, real fear flashed across Derek's face. You're lying. Am I? You were on the phone at 2 in the morning. Your office door was cracked. I stood in the hallway and recorded every word. Derek moved fast, grabbing her phone from the nightstand. He scrolled through it frantically, finding nothing. Where is it? Somewhere you'll never find it. His hand closed around her wrist, squeezing until she gasped. Tell me where the recording is. Grace, let go of me. You stupid, stupid woman. Do you have any idea what you've done? His voice was no longer smooth and controlled. It was raw and furious. Everything was perfect. Everything was planned. And you couldn't just play your part. My part, I'm not an actress in your scheme. Derek, I'm a person. He released her wrist, but his eyes held something dark and final. Get dressed. We're going for a drive. I'm not going anywhere with you. Yes, you are. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the closet. Put on clothes. Now. Grace's heart raced. The recording was safe in the cloud, but she was not. She was alone in a penthouse with a man who had just admitted to 2 years of lies. A man whose carefully constructed plan was unraveling. Derek, please, think about the baby. I am thinking about her. I'm thinking about how much easier this would be if you had just stayed ignorant and grateful. Get dressed. Grace, we're leaving. As she pulled on clothes with shaking hands, Grace understood that the confrontation had ended. Whatever came next would be worse. The drive through Chicago felt surreal. Derek's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, while rain began to fall against the windshield. Grace sat in the passenger seat, one hand protectively over her belly, watching the familiar streets blur past. "Where are we going?" she asked for the third time. Derek did not answer. His jaw was clenched, his eyes fixed on the road. They had been driving for 20 minutes, moving farther from downtown, into neighborhoods Grace did not recognize. "Derek, please, let's go home. We can figure this out." "Figure what out, Joe?" "Grace, how to undo your betrayal. How to fix the fact that you recorded a private conversation. You were planning to have me committed to take our daughter from me. I was planning our future, making sure everything was handled properly. But you had to play detective. You had to ruin everything." His voice was cold, detached, as if he was talking about a failed business deal rather than their marriage. The rain came down harder now, the wipers struggling to keep the windshield clear. They turned onto a side street, then another, moving into an area where the street lights were sparse and buildings looked abandoned. Grace's fear crystallized into certainty. "What are you doing?" Derek pulled the car to the curb and stopped. They were on a nearly deserted street, industrial warehouses on one side, empty lots on the other. No pedestrians, no traffic, just rain and darkness. "Get out," Derek said quietly. "What?" He turned to face her, and his expression was completely empty. "Get out of the car, Grace." "Derek, I'm 7 months pregnant. It's raining. We're in the middle of nowhere. That's not my problem anymore. You can't be serious." He reached across her and opened the passenger door. Rain immediately swept in, soaking the seat, her clothes. "I said get out." "No." Grace gripped the door handle. "I'm your wife. I'm carrying your daughter. You were useful when you were obedient. Now you're a liability." He unbuckled her seatbelt with one hand. "If you won't get out, I'll help you." Before Grace could react, Derek grabbed her arm and pushed. She tried to hold on, but pregnant and off balance, she could not fight his strength. She tumbled out of the car onto the wet pavement, her hands barely breaking her fall. Pain shot through her knees and palms as they hit concrete. She curled instinctively around her belly, protecting the baby. "Derek, please." He leaned over to pull the door shut, his face illuminated briefly by the dome light. "You wanted to fight me. Grace, good luck. You have no phone, no money, no one who will believe you. By morning, I'll have filed a missing persons report, told everyone you've been having episodes, that you ran away in a state of confusion. I have the recording, which no one will ever hear, because who's going to give a hysterical pregnant woman the time of day? I've spent 2 years building your reputation as fragile. One night on the streets will only prove me right. Someone will help me, maybe, or maybe you'll just disappear. Either way, you're no longer my concern." The door slammed shut. The engine roared. Tires screeched against wet asphalt, spraying water across her legs. Grace watched the red taillights disappear around the corner, the sound fading until there was only rain. For a long moment, she could not move, could not think. The cold seeped through her clothes and the baby kicked hard, protesting. That kick jolted Grace back to reality. She pushed herself up from the pavement, her palms scraped and bleeding. Her nightgown, the one she had put on before the drive, clung to her skin. She had no coat, no shoes beyond thin slippers that were already soaked through. The street was deserted. A single street light flickered at the far end of the block, offering weak illumination. Grace started walking toward it, each step sending shockwaves through her body. She needed help. A phone, police, something. But Derek's words echoed in her mind. "I've spent 2 years building your reputation as fragile." Who would believe her, a soaking wet, pregnant woman, babbling about being thrown from a car by her wealthy husband? The baby kicked again, harder this time. Grace pressed her hand to her belly. "I know, sweetheart. I know. Mama's going to get us help. I promise." She walked another block, her legs shaking from cold and exhaustion. Ahead, she saw lights. A corner store still open. Grace stumbled toward it like a beacon. But before she reached the door, dizziness swept over her. The world tilted. Her knees buckled. She hit the pavement a second time, this time unable to catch herself. Pain radiated through her hip, her shoulder, and then, terrifyingly, a sharp cramping sensation in her abdomen. No, not the baby. Please, not the baby. Help! Grace tried to call out, but her voice was weak, lost in the sound of rain. Someone help me. Footsteps approached. A figure appeared, backlit by the store lights. A woman's voice? Alarmed. Oh my God, miss, can you hear me? Grace tried to focus on the face above her. A woman, maybe in her 30s, wearing scrubs under a raincoat. I'm pregnant, Grace managed. 7 months, please. I'm a nurse. My name's Ruby. Stay still. Okay, I'm calling an ambulance. Ruby crouched beside her, shielding Grace from the rain with her body while dialing on her phone. 911, I need an ambulance immediately. Pregnant woman, late 3rd trimester, collapsed on the street. She's conscious but in distress. Grace grabbed Ruby's hand. My husband, he left me here. He's trying to steal my inheritance. I have proof, but he took my phone. Please, you have to believe me. Ruby's expression flickered with something, concern or maybe doubt. Let's focus on getting you safe first. Okay? The ambulance is coming. You don't understand. He's going to tell them I'm crazy. He'll say I ran away, that I'm unstable. But I'm not. I have a recording. It's in my email. In the cloud. I can prove everything. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. We'll figure it out, Ruby said gently. Right now, we need to make sure you and your baby are okay. As the ambulance lights illuminated the street, Grace felt consciousness slipping. The last thing she saw was Ruby's face, and the last thing she thought was whether anyone would believe her when she woke up. Grace woke to bright lights and the steady beep of monitors. Northwestern Memorial Hospital. She tried to sit up, but a hand gently pressed her shoulder back down. Easy there. You've been through an ordeal. Ruby's face came into focus, still wearing scrubs. I rode with you in the ambulance, wanted to make sure you were okay. The baby. Grace's hand flew to her belly. Heartbeat strong. Doctor says you're both stable, but you need rest. You were severely dehydrated and hypothermic. Relief flooded through Grace so powerfully she started crying. Thank you. Thank you for finding me. Ruby pulled a chair close. The police are here. They want to talk to you about what happened. Grace's stomach clenched. Did they say who called them? Your husband. He filed a missing persons report 2 hours ago. Said you left the house in a confused state. Of course he did. The door opened, and 2 officers entered. One was older, with silver hair and a weathered face. The other younger, his expression neutral. The older one smiled warmly. Mrs. Ashford, I'm Officer Brennan. This is Officer Hayes. Your husband's been worried sick about you. Grace's instincts screamed a warning. Something about Officer Brennan's smile felt rehearsed. I didn't leave confused, Grace said carefully. My husband threw me out of the car, abandoned me on the street while I'm 7 months pregnant. Officer Brennan's smile never wavered. Ma'am, your husband told us you've been having some episodes lately. Anxiety, confusion. He said you've been very stressed about the pregnancy. That's what he wants you to think. He's been isolating me, controlling me. He married me for my inheritance, and now he's trying to have me committed so he can steal it. The officers exchanged a look. Officer Hayes spoke up. That's a serious accusation. Do you have any evidence? Yes, I have a recording. He was on the phone with his mistress, planning how to declare me incompetent and take control of my assets. It's in my email, in cloud storage. Officer Brennan's expression shifted slightly. Your husband mentioned you might say something like this. He's concerned about your mental state, Mrs. Ashford, making accusations about mistresses and stolen inheritances. Well, it sounds like you're under a lot of stress. I'm telling you the truth. What do you? Where's this recording now? In my university email. I can log in and show you. Do you have your phone? Grace's heart sank. He took it, smashed it before he threw me out of the car. Officer Brennan nodded slowly as if confirming something. So there's no phone and no immediate access to this supposed evidence. It's not supposed evidence, it's real. I can access my email from any computer. The door opened again, and Grace's blood turned to ice. Derek strode in, his expression the picture of a worried husband. His eyes were red, as if he had been crying. His hair was disheveled. He looked like he had been searching for her all night. Grace, thank God. He moved toward her bed, but Ruby stepped between them. Sir, she needs rest. Derek ignored Ruby, his attention fixed on Grace. Honey, I've been so worried. Why did you run off like that? I didn't run off. You threw me out of the car. Derek turned to the officers, his expression pained. You see, this is what I was telling you about. She's been having these episodes where she misremembers things, makes up scenarios. Our therapist warned us it might get worse as the pregnancy progressed. We don't have a therapist. Dr. Matthews, we've been seeing him for 3 months. Derek pulled out his phone, showing what looked like appointment confirmations. I can call him right now if you need verification. Grace realized with horror how thoroughly he had prepared. False appointments, a narrative of instability, evidence planted weeks or months in advance. Officer Brennan cleared his throat. Mrs. Ashford, I think what you need right now is rest and proper medical care. Your husband has agreed to have Dr. Matthews come evaluate you tomorrow. Make sure you're getting the support you need. No. Grace tried to sit up, despite Ruby's restraining hand. You don't understand. He's manipulating you. He's been planning this for 2 years. There's an inheritance. Montgomery Industries. Billions of dollars. And he targeted me to get access to it. Derek's expression was perfect concern mixed with sadness. Montgomery Industries was her grandfather's company. He died 3 years ago and left nothing to Grace's father, who was estranged from the family. Grace has been fixated on the idea that she was secretly an heiress. It's a fantasy she's constructed to cope with losing him. That's a lie. Honey, please, let's get you the help you need. Officer Brennan put his notepad away. Mr. Ashford, we'll file the report that your wife was found safe. I'd recommend keeping close supervision. If she tries to leave again, she won't, Derek said firmly. I'll make sure she's never out of sight. As the officers left, Grace saw Officer Brennan and Derek exchange a subtle nod. They knew each other. Derek had planned for this too. Please, Grace turned desperately to Ruby. You have to believe me, I'm not crazy. He's been setting this up for years. Ruby's expression was conflicted. I'll talk to your doctor about keeping you here for observation. A few days at least, until we're sure you and the baby are stable. Thank you, Grace breathed. But Derek smiled. Of course, whatever Grace needs, I'll stay right here with her. As Ruby left to speak with the doctor, Derek leaned close to Grace's bed. His voice dropped to a whisper only she could hear. That was a nice try. The recording story. The dramatic collapse. But I've been 3 steps ahead of you from the beginning. Brennan's a friend of mine. Been on my payroll for 5 years. Dr. Matthews will confirm you've been treated for anxiety and paranoid delusions. And by tomorrow, you'll be transferred to a very comfortable psychiatric facility where you can rest until the baby's born. Someone will believe me. Who you have no friends, no family who cares, no evidence anyone can see. You're a pregnant woman having a breakdown. That's all anyone sees. That's all anyone will ever see. He straightened, his public mask sliding back into place. Get some rest, honey. You've had a difficult night. As he walked out, Grace realized the first battle was lost. Derek had turned her rescue into proof of his narrative. But somewhere in her mind, a stubborn voice insisted this was not over. She just had to figure out how to fight back. Grace spent the next 2 days in the hospital under observation. Derek visited every few hours, playing the devoted husband for the staff while making veiled threats when they were alone. Dr. Matthews, a psychiatrist she had never met, came to evaluate her and concluded she was experiencing acute prenatal anxiety with paranoid features. Ruby checked on her whenever her shift allowed, and Grace sensed the nurse did not fully believe Derek's story. But without proof, there was nothing Ruby could do. On the 3rd morning, as Grace was eating breakfast and mentally preparing for the psychiatric transfer Derek had arranged, there was a knock at her door. A man entered, older, maybe late 50s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a leather briefcase. Mrs. Montgomery, he said, and Grace's heart skipped. Montgomery, not Ashford. Who are you? My name is Benjamin Crawford. I'm an attorney. I've been searching for you for a very long time. He set his briefcase on the table and pulled out identification, Illinois State Bar license, business cards for Crawford and Associates. I don't understand. Ben pulled up a chair, glancing at the door before speaking quietly. Your grandfather, Howard Montgomery, was my closest friend for 40 years. When he died 3 years ago, he left explicit instructions in his will. Everything he built, Montgomery Industries, the real estate holdings, investment portfolios, all of it, was to go to you, his only living descendant. On Grace's breath caught. Derek said Grandpa Howard left nothing to my father. That's partially true. Your grandfather was estranged from your father, Thomas, due to Thomas's addiction issues, but Howard never stopped looking for you. He hired investigators to track you down. When he finally found you, about 6 months before he died, he updated his will to make you the sole heir. I never knew he was looking for me. That's because someone intercepted his attempts to contact you. Howard sent letters to your apartment at Northwestern. They were returned as undeliverable. Even though you lived there, he tried calling, but the number was always disconnected or busy. Someone made sure you two never connected. Grace thought back 3 years. She had just started dating Derek. Derek, she whispered. He worked in mergers and acquisitions. He would have had access to probate records. Exactly. We believe Derek Ashford discovered the Montgomery will during his work. He saw that you were set to inherit billions, researched your background, and systematically positioned himself to gain control of those assets through marriage. How did you find me? Ruby Mitchell, your nurse. She heard your story about the recording and the inheritance. She has a sister who works as a paralegal at my firm. Ruby called her, and her sister called me. When she mentioned Montgomery Industries, I knew immediately who you must be. Ben opened his briefcase and pulled out documents. This is your grandfather's will, authenticated and notarized. This is your birth certificate, showing you're Howard's granddaughter through his son Thomas. And these are corporate documents showing Montgomery Industries' current value, $2.4 billion. Grace stared at the papers, her hands shaking. Why didn't anyone contact me after he died? The will was contested by a distant cousin who claimed Howard was incompetent when he wrote it. That tied everything up in probate for nearly 3 years. The challenge was finally dismissed 2 months ago. We've been searching for you ever since, but your husband made sure you were very hard to find. He's been planning this the entire time. Yes, and now he's trying to have you declared incompetent so he can claim guardianship over you and control of your assets. But Grace, you're not powerless. You have legal rights. You have Mevat. And if you truly have a recording of him admitting to this conspiracy, we can stop him. Grace's mind raced. The recording is in my old university email. I uploaded it to cloud storage before Derek took my phone. Ben pulled out a tablet. Let's access it now. With shaking hands, Grace logged into her Northwestern email account. The message was still there, sent to herself 3 nights ago. She downloaded the audio file and played it. Derek's voice filled the room. Grace doesn't know she inherited Montgomery Industries. The old man left everything to her. Not her deadbeat father. Vanessa's responses. Their entire plan laid out in 6 minutes of recorded conversation. Ben listened to the entire thing, his expression growing darker. When it ended, he looked at Grace with something like admiration. This is ironclad evidence of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted coercion. Combined with the will and the timeline of Derek's pursuit of you, we have a case that will destroy him. He said no one would believe me. He's wrong. Judge Patricia Winters handles family court in Cook County. She's known for her intolerance of financial abuse and manipulation. We'll file for an emergency injunction first thing tomorrow morning, get you protected. Then we'll move to establish your rightful inheritance and press criminal charges against your husband. For the first time in 3 days, Grace felt a flicker of hope. He has Officer Brennan on his payroll, probably others. Then we'll go over their heads. Federal investigators take financial crimes very seriously, especially when billions are involved. Ben gathered the documents. But first, we need to keep you safe. Derek will try to move you to that psychiatric facility tomorrow. I'm going to file paperwork tonight to block the transfer. Can you trust me? Grace looked at this man, a stranger who knew her grandfather, who had been searching for her, who believed her when no one else would. Yes. Good. Ruby's going to help us coordinate. She's agreed to testify about what she witnessed the night she found you. We'll also need her testimony about Derek's behavior at the hospital. Ben stood, his expression determined. Your grandfather was a fighter. Grace, he built an empire from nothing. He would want you to fight for what's yours. I will. For my daughter, for myself, and for the grandfather I never got to know. Ben nodded. Tomorrow, we begin taking your life back. After he left, Grace sat alone in the hospital room, one hand on her belly, the recording playing again through her mind. Derek thought he had won. He thought she was defeated. He was about to learn what Montgomery women were made of. The emergency hearing took place 3 days later in Cook County Family Court. Judge Patricia Winters, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes, presided. Grace sat beside Ben Crawford, wearing clothes Ruby had brought her belly prominent beneath a simple dress. Across the aisle, Derek sat with his attorney, Marcus Webb, one of Chicago's most expensive lawyers. Derek's expression was confident, almost bored, as if this hearing was merely an inconvenience. Judge Winters called the court to order. I've reviewed the emergency petition. Mr. Crawford, you claim your client has been the victim of financial manipulation and is the rightful heir to Montgomery Industries. That's quite an allegation. Ben stood. Your Honor, we have substantial evidence. First, the authenticated will of Howard Montgomery, which clearly names Grace Montgomery as sole beneficiary. Second, a recording of Mr. Ashford admitting to marrying my client specifically to gain access to this inheritance. I'd like to hear this recording. Ben played the audio. Derek's voice filled the courtroom, every word damning. Grace doesn't know she inherited Montgomery Industries. The old man left everything to her, not her deadbeat father. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Derek's confident expression faltered. When the recording ended, Judge Winters fixed Derek with a stare that could cut glass. Mr. Ashford, do you deny that's your voice? Marcus Webb stood quickly. Your Honor, we question the authenticity and the legality of this recording. It was made without my client's knowledge or consent, which may violate wiretapping laws. Illinois is a one-party consent state, Ben countered. Mrs. Ashford was a party to the conversation. Even if she was listening from another room, the recording is admissible. Judge Winters nodded slowly. I'm inclined to agree. However, I'd like to hear from Mrs. Ashford directly. Ma'am, please take the stand. Grace's legs shook as she walked to the witness box, but she kept her head high. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Ben guided her through the testimony. How Derek had isolated her, controlled her finances, thrown her out of the car. Her voice remained steady, even when describing the night on the street. Then Marcus Webb stood for cross-examination. Mrs. Ashford, have you been under a doctor's care for anxiety? My husband arranged appointments I never consented to. But Dr. Matthews has your signature on intake forms. Are you saying you didn't sign those? Grace hesitated. She did not remember signing anything, but Derek could have forged her signature. I don't recall signing them. You don't recall? Is it possible your memory's faulty, that you're confused about events? I'm not confused about my husband planning to steal my inheritance. Mrs. Ashford, isn't it true that you've been estranged from your father for years, that you have a history of family conflict? My father had addiction issues. That's why my grandfather left the inheritance to me directly. Or perhaps your grandfather didn't trust your judgment either. Webb's smile was predatory. After all, you dropped out of graduate school. You have no work history, no financial experience. Perhaps Mr. Ashford was trying to protect assets you're not qualified to manage. Objection, Ben called. Counsel is testifying. Sustained, Judge Winters said. Mr. Webb, ask questions. Don't make speeches. But the damage was planted. Grace saw doubt flicker across the judge's face. The hearing continued for 2 more hours. Ruby testified about finding Grace on the street. Ben presented financial records showing Derek's research into Montgomery Industries before meeting Grace. But Webb countered each point, suggesting Grace was mentally fragile, that Derek's research was standard due diligence, that the recording was taken out of context. Finally, Judge Winters rendered her decision. I'm granting a temporary restraining order. Mr. Ashford, you are prohibited from contacting Mrs. Ashford directly. However, given the complexity of this case and questions about the will's validity, I'm ordering a full hearing in 30 days to determine inheritance rights. Until then, Montgomery Industries will remain in trust administration. It was not a complete victory, but Grace felt relief flood through her. 30 days. She had 30 days to build her case. As they left the courtroom, Ben squeezed her shoulder. It's a start. We'll use this time to strengthen our evidence. But as they walked down the courthouse steps, two police officers approached. Not Officer Brennan this time, but detectives with badges. Grace Montgomery Ashford, the lead detective, said, "Yes, you are under arrest for embezzlement in wire fraud." Grace's world tilted. "What?" The detective pulled out handcuffs. "We have warrants. You're accused of transferring $2 million from Montgomery Industries accounts to offshore holdings in your name. You have the right to remain silent." "This is insane." Ben stepped forward. "My client has never even accessed those accounts. She just found out about the inheritance last week." "Tell it to the judge, ma'am. Hands behind your back." As the cold metal closed around her wrists, Grace saw Derek standing near his car, phone to his ear, a smile playing at his lips. This was his countermove. If he could not have her declared incompetent, he would have her arrested as a criminal. News cameras appeared from nowhere, as if alerted in advance. Flashes exploded. Reporters shouted questions. Grace heard the headlines forming, "Heiress arrested for stealing from own company." Ben walked beside her as the detectives led her to their car. "I'll have you out on bail within hours. This is a setup. Grace, we'll prove it." But as Grace sat in the back of the police car, her hands cuffed, her pregnant belly pressed against the seatbelt, she realized Derek had been several moves ahead once again. He had planted evidence, forged transactions, built a narrative where she appeared guilty of the very crime he was committing. The car pulled away from the courthouse, and Grace watched through the window as Derek walked to his Mercedes, free and smiling. Beside him stood a woman Grace recognized from photos she had found in his office weeks ago. Vanessa, his mistress, his partner in conspiracy. And Vanessa was wearing a coat that could not quite hide what looked like a pregnant belly of her own. Grace's stomach dropped. How many more secrets were waiting to destroy her? Grace spent 6 hours in county jail before Ben posted bail. The concrete walls, the harsh fluorescent lights, the smell of disinfectant and despair, all of it was calculated to break her spirit. But Grace held on to one thought: Derek had made a mistake. Criminals who got cocky made errors. Ruby met them outside the jail with clean clothes and a fierce hug. "You okay?" "I've been better," Grace admitted. The baby had been kicking constantly, as if protesting this whole ordeal. "But I'm not giving up." "Good, because I did some digging." Ruby held up her phone. "That woman who was with Derek at the courthouse, Vanessa Hartley. She works at a gallery in River North. And here's the interesting part. She was admitted to Northwestern Memorial 6 months ago for prenatal care. First trimester." Ben's eyes sharpened. "Derek got her pregnant while married to Grace. It gets better. I pulled public records. Derek and Vanessa have a marriage license from Las Vegas, dated 6 years ago." Grace felt the world tilt again. 6 years, but we've been married for 2 years. Exactly. Which means Derek was already married when he married you. Your marriage to him is invalid. You were never legally his wife. The implications crashed over Grace like a wave. "So he never had any legal claim to my inheritance at all?" "None," Ben confirmed, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Everything he's done, the manipulation, the isolation, the attempted psychiatric commitment, it was all based on a fraud. He was never your husband." "Why would he risk bigamy?" "Because he was arrogant," Ben said. "He thought you'd never find out about Vanessa. And technically, your marriage doesn't exist legally, so there's no community property claim. He was planning to get guardianship over you through the incompetency angle, not through marital rights." Grace's mind raced. "We need to get back to the Montgomery estate. If Derek thinks he's won, he might have dropped his guard." They drove to the Lake Forest mansion, the home Grace's grandfather had built. As they pulled up the long driveway, Grace saw lights on inside and several cars parked in front. "He's having a party," she said in disbelief. Through the tall windows, Grace could see people moving inside. Laughter drifted across the lawn. Her grandfather's home, filled with Derek's friends, celebrating his victory. "Stay here," Ben said. "Let me." But Grace was already out of the car, walking toward the front door. Ruby and Ben hurried after her. The door was unlocked. Grace walked straight in. The grand foyer, which she remembered from childhood visits, had been transformed. Modern furniture replaced her grandfather's antiques. Abstract art hung where family portraits once were. And in the center of the living room, holding court, stood Derek and Vanessa. Vanessa was indeed pregnant, maybe 6 months along, wearing a designer dress that accentuated rather than hid her belly. She held a champagne glass, laughing at something one of the guests said. The room fell silent when Grace entered. Derek recovered first, his expression shifting to theatrical surprise. "Grace, I wasn't expecting you. I thought you'd still be in jail where you put me with forged embezzlement charges." Grace's voice carried through the room. "Surprise. I made bail." Vanessa set down her glass, her smile sharp. "Derek, darling, should I call security?" "Security." Grace looked around at the assembled guests. Chicago's social elite, people who had known her grandfather. "In my house." "Your house?" Vanessa laughed. "Honey, this is Derek's house. He inherited it as Howard Montgomery's business partner." "That's a lie." Ben stepped forward, pulling documents from his briefcase. "This property is deeded to Grace Montgomery under her grandfather's will. Mr. Ashford has no legal claim to it whatsoever." Derek's mask slipped for a moment. Then he recovered, addressing the guests with practiced charm. "Everyone, I apologize. My wife has been unwell. Prenatal psychosis. She's been making wild accusations. It's very sad." "I'm not your wife," Grace said clearly. "You're already married to Vanessa. Have been for 6 years, which makes our marriage invalid, which means you have no legal connection to me or my inheritance." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Vanessa's face went white. "That's absurd," Derek said, but his voice lacked conviction. Ruby held up her phone. Marriage license. Derek Ashford and Vanessa Hartley. Las Vegas, Nevada. 6 years ago. Public record. One of the guests, an older woman Grace vaguely recognized, spoke up. "Derek, is this true you're a bigamist?" "It's a misunderstanding. That Vegas thing was never official. It's signed by an officiant and registered with the state." Ben interrupted. "It's completely official, which means when you married Grace 2 years later, you committed bigamy. A felony in Illinois." The crowd began murmuring, some people already moving toward the exit. Chicago society might tolerate many things, but public scandal mixed with criminal activity was not one of them. Vanessa turned on Derek, her voice rising. "You said that marriage wasn't legal. You said it was just a ceremony, that we never filed the paperwork." "Vanessa, shut up." "No, you dragged me into this. You said we'd be rich. You said Grace was just a mark, someone too stupid to realize what was happening." Vanessa was crying now, her carefully applied makeup running. "You said once you had control of Montgomery Industries. We'd go public, get remarried properly, and live like royalty." "I said shut up." Derek grabbed Vanessa's arm, and several guests stepped back in alarm. Grace felt a strange calm settle over her. She had spent 2 years being manipulated, controlled, made to feel worthless. But watching Derek's empire crumble in real time, seeing his perfect plan fall apart, she realized something. She was not the weak one. He was. "Derek," Grace said quietly, and everyone turned to look at her. "You made one critical mistake. You underestimated me. You thought I'd stay scared, stay isolated, stay silent. But I didn't. And now everyone knows exactly what you are." Derek's face twisted with rage. He took a step toward Grace, and Ben immediately moved between them. "I wouldn't," Ben said calmly. "There are witnesses, and given that you're already facing fraud charges, assault would just add to your prison sentence." "Prison, Derek laughed, but it sounded hollow. "You think any of this will stick? I have lawyers. I have connections. I'll walk away from this." "We'll see," Anadishti, Grace said, "because tomorrow, we're going to court. And this time, the truth is coming out." The courtroom was packed. 3 weeks after the confrontation at the Montgomery estate, the criminal trial against Derek Ashford had become Chicago's most watched legal proceeding. Reporters lined the hallway, cameras flashing as Grace arrived with Ben Crawford. She was 8.5 months pregnant now, moving slowly. But her resolve had never been stronger. In the weeks since Derek's party fell apart, everything had shifted. The bigamy revelation triggered an investigation that uncovered Derek's forgeries, his planted embezzlement evidence, his payments to Officer Brennan. Vanessa, facing conspiracy charges of her own, had taken a plea deal. In exchange for testimony against Derek, she would serve probation instead of prison time. She was waiting in the witness room now, preparing to destroy the man she had loved. Judge Patricia Winters presided again, her expression grave as she called the court to order. Derek sat at the defense table with Marcus Webb, his confidence from weeks ago replaced with barely contained panic. The state versus Derek Ashford, the bailiff announced. Charges include fraud, conspiracy, bigamy, coercion, and attempted kidnapping. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Margaret Sullivan, stood to present the opening statement. She was in her mid-40s, known throughout Cook County for her relentless pursuit of financial crimes. Her gray suit was immaculate, her voice clear and commanding as she outlined Derek's calculated pursuit of Grace, his fake marriage, his systematic isolation of her, and his plan to steal her inheritance through forced guardianship. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Sullivan began, pacing slowly before the jury box. This is not a story about a marriage gone wrong. This is a story about predation, about a man who researched, targeted, and married a woman solely to steal a $2.4 billion inheritance. And when she discovered his plan, he tried to have her erased. Then she called the first witness. Benjamin Crawford took the stand and presented Howard Montgomery's will, authenticated beyond doubt. He testified about searching for Grace for years, about Derek's interference with Howard's attempts to contact his granddaughter. Mr. Crawford, Sullivan asked, when did you first learn that Derek Ashford had knowledge of the Montgomery inheritance before meeting Grace? Through his employment records at the mergers and acquisitions firm. He handled probate documents for Montgomery Industries 3 years ago, 4 months before he supposedly met Grace by chance at a coffee shop. And what did that tell you? That the meeting was not chance. It was calculated. The second witness was Ruby Mitchell. She described finding Grace on the street, pregnant and abandoned, described Derek's performance at the hospital, and the subtle coordination with Officer Brennan. Ms. Mitchell, Sullivan continued, you're a trained medical professional. In your assessment, was Grace Ashford in any state to have wandered away from home on her own? Absolutely not. She was hypothermic, dehydrated, and in the late 3rd trimester of pregnancy, she had abrasions on her hands and knees as consistent with being pushed or thrown. This was not a woman who left voluntarily. The third witness was Officer Brennan himself, who had been given immunity in exchange for testimony. He admitted Derek had paid him $5,000 per month to be available for situations requiring police presence. He had falsified Grace's missing persons report and would have testified she was mentally unstable if needed. Officer Brennan, Sullivan's voice was cold now. How many times did Derek Ashford pay you to intervene in situations involving his wife? 3 times over 2 years. Once when she tried to contact her father. Once when a college friend tried to visit. And the night at the hospital, gasps rippled through the courtroom. But the testimony that broke the case came from Vanessa. She took the stand wearing a simple dress, her pregnancy now obvious, her eyes red from crying. Prosecutor Sullivan approached gently. Ms. Hartley, how long have you known Derek Ashford? 7 years. We met at an art gallery in River North. And when did your relationship become romantic? Almost immediately, within 3 months. We flew to Vegas and got married. Vanessa's voice shook. Derek said it was impulsive, romantic. I thought it was real. When did you learn about Grace Montgomery? About 4 years ago, Derek came home excited one night, said he'd found a way to secure our future. He showed me documents about Montgomery Industries and a woman named Grace who was set to inherit billions. He said she was perfect, isolated from family, naive, easy to manipulate. The courtroom murmured. Judge Winters called for order. What was the plan? Sullivan asked. Derek would pursue Grace, marry her, get her pregnant to create leverage, then have her declared incompetent. He'd been researching legal guardianship laws for months. Once he had control, he'd transfer the assets and divorce Grace, claiming she was too unstable to care for herself or the child. And you agreed to this? Vanessa wiped her eyes. I thought I loved him. I thought we were partners. He said Grace would be fine, that she'd get a settlement and wouldn't even know what she'd lost. I didn't realize how cruel it would be, how he'd isolate her, control her, throw her out on the street while pregnant. When did you become pregnant with his child? 6 months ago. He said it was time to build our real family, that Grace's baby was just part of the plan, but our baby would be ours to keep. Grace sat at the prosecution table, listening to her entire marriage reduced to a calculated con. Part of her wanted to look at Derek, to see his reaction, but she kept her eyes forward. Prosecutor Sullivan continued, Did Derek tell you about his plan to frame Grace for embezzlement? Yes, he forged documents showing transfers to offshore accounts. He had someone at Montgomery Industries create false transaction records. He said even if the guardianship angle failed, criminal charges would discredit her enough that a judge would give him control anyway. No further questions. Marcus Webb stood for cross-examination, but there was little he could do. Vanessa's testimony was corroborated by documents, recordings, witness statements. He attacked her credibility, suggested she was lying to reduce her own sentence. But the evidence spoke for itself. Finally, Prosecutor Sullivan called Grace. She walked to the stand slowly, one hand supporting her belly. After being sworn in, she sat carefully and looked at the courtroom, at the reporters, at the jury. At Derek, who finally met her eyes, Sullivan asked her to tell her story. Grace did. She described meeting Derek, how charming he had been, how he had gradually isolated her from friends and family, how he had controlled every aspect of her life. She described the night she overheard his phone call, the recording she made, the confrontation that followed, being thrown from the car while 7 months pregnant, the fear, the cold, the certainty that she and her baby would die. Her voice never wavered. She had lived through hell, and she refused to let Derek see her break. When she described the hospital, Officer Brennan's betrayal, Derek's performance as the concerned husband, she saw several jury members shaking their heads in disgust. Then Marcus Webb stood for cross-examination. Mrs. Montgomery, isn't it true you have no business experience? That's correct. And you dropped out of graduate school? Yes, because Derek convinced me I didn't need it. Well, so you made that choice. No one forced you. He manipulated me. There's a difference between a choice and coercion. Webb changed tactics. You claim my client married you for money, but you loved him, didn't you? You chose to marry him. I loved who I thought he was. That person didn't exist. Derek Ashford is a lie from beginning to end. Yet you recorded him without his knowledge. You went through his private files. Some might say you were the one acting dishonestly. Grace leaned forward slightly. I recorded him to protect myself and my daughter. I went through his files because he was stealing my inheritance. Everything I did was self-defense. Everything he did was predatory. There's no comparison. The courtroom erupted in applause. Judge Winters called for order, but did not seem displeased. Prosecutor Sullivan stood for redirect. Mrs. Montgomery, in all the time you were married to Derek Ashford, did he ever once tell you about your grandfather's will? Never. Did he ever mention that you were an heiress? Not once. He kept me in the dark about my own identity. And when you discovered the truth, what did he do? Grace's voice was steady, but her eyes were fierce. He threw me away, like I was garbage, because I was no longer useful to his plan. Sullivan nodded. No further questions, Your Honor. After 3 days of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for 5 hours. Grace sat in the courthouse hallway with Ben and Ruby, one hand on her belly, feeling her daughter kick. Whatever happens, she said quietly. We tried. We didn't just try, Ben said. Oopty. We won. The jury knows the truth now. The bailiff appeared. The jury has reached a verdict. The courtroom filled again. Grace took her seat. Derek sat rigid at the defense table, his face pale. The jury foreman stood. In the case of the state versus Derek Ashford, on the charge of fraud in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy, guilty. On the charge of bigamy, guilty. On the charge of coercion, guilty. On the charge of attempted kidnapping. Guilty. The word guilty echoed 5 times, each one landing like a hammer blow. Judge Winters addressed Derek. Mr. Ashford, you have been found guilty on all counts. Given the premeditated nature of your crimes, the vulnerability of your victim, and the sheer scope of your deception, I am sentencing you to 15 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 10 years. She turned to Vanessa. Ms. Hartley, under the terms of your plea agreement, you will serve 5 years probation and complete 1,000 hours of community service working with victims of financial abuse. As the bailiff led Derek away in handcuffs, he looked at Grace one last time. His expression held rage, disbelief, and something else, the dawning realization that he had underestimated her from the beginning. Grace met his gaze steadily, holding her belly, and said nothing. She did not need to. Her survival, her strength, her victory, they were statement enough. Prosecutor Margaret Sullivan approached Grace as the courtroom emptied. You were incredibly brave up there, Mrs. Montgomery. Not many people could have withstood that kind of cross-examination. Thank you, Grace said. For believing me, for fighting for me, Sullivan smiled. The evidence fought for you. I just made sure the jury heard it clearly. She handed Grace her card. If you ever need anything, please don't hesitate to call. What you've been through, it matters. And I hope you know that your testimony today might help other women find their own courage. As Sullivan walked away, Grace felt Ruby's arm around her shoulders. Come on, let's get you somewhere you can rest. That baby's going to arrive any day now. Grace nodded, exhausted but at peace. The trial was over. Derek was going to prison, and for the first time in 2 years, she was truly free. As they stepped out into the late afternoon sun, Grace whispered to her unborn daughter, "It's over, sweetheart. The bad part is over. Everything from here is ours to build." And somewhere above, she liked to imagine her grandfather Howard was smiling, proud of the Montgomery woman his granddaughter had become. Grace's water broke in the courthouse parking lot. She had just finished signing the final documents, transferring full control of Montgomery Industries into her name when the first contraction hit. Ruby, who had stayed for the verdict, immediately shifted into nurse mode. Okay, it's 50. We're going to Northwestern Memorial. Ben, you drive. Grace, breathe through it, nice and steady. The delivery took 8 hours. Grace had never experienced pain like this, but she welcomed it. Pain meant her daughter was coming. Pain meant life continuing, despite everything Derek had tried to do. Ruby stayed the entire time, holding Grace's hand, coaching her breathing. Ben waited in the hallway, ready to handle any legal issues that might arise. At 3:27 in the morning, Hope Elizabeth Montgomery was born. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Perfect. As the nurse placed the baby in Grace's arms, Grace looked down at her daughter's face and felt something shift deep inside. For 2 years, she had been living in Derek's story, playing the role he had written for her. But this tiny person represented a different story, one where Grace was not a victim but a survivor, not weak but resilient. "Hello, Hope," Grace whispered. "Your mama's got you, and I promise you'll never doubt that you're loved. You'll never wonder if you're worth protecting, and you'll never, ever be anyone's pawn." Ruby wiped tears from her own eyes. "She's beautiful. She's mine," Grace said fiercely. "Really mine. No one can take her from me." 6 months later, Grace stood in the boardroom of Montgomery Industries, her daughter in a carrier strapped to her chest. The board of directors sat around the table, men and women who had run the company during the probate limbo. They looked at her with curiosity and skepticism. "Thank you all for staying on during the transition," Grace began. "I know many of you doubt whether I'm qualified to run this company. I'm 29 years old. I dropped out of graduate school. I have no business experience." She paused, letting the words hang. "But what I do have is something my grandfather valued above credentials. I have resilience. I have the ability to survive when powerful people try to destroy me. I have the willingness to fight for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible." Grace pulled out a folder. "I've spent the last 6 months studying every aspect of this company, the manufacturing plants, the supply chains, the competition, the markets. I've met with every department head. I've read my grandfather's notes and letters, and I've developed a plan. She distributed packets to the board members. Montgomery Industries was built on American manufacturing, but we've been losing ground to cheaper overseas production. I'm proposing we pivot, focus on sustainable manufacturing, partner with green energy companies, position ourselves as the ethical choice for American consumers who care about where their products come from. The board members flipped through the proposal. Grace saw surprise on several faces. "This is actually well researched," one board member said, "because I did the work. I'm not here to be a figurehead while someone else runs the company. I'm here to lead. And if anyone at this table can't accept that, I'll accept your resignation effective immediately." No one resigned. Over the next year, Grace transformed Montgomery Industries. She hired Amy Fletcher, Derek's first wife and fellow victim, to run human resources. She established the Hope Foundation, providing legal aid and financial support for women escaping abusive relationships. She restructured the company's manufacturing practices, leading to both increased profitability and environmental recognition. Forbes wrote a feature, From Victim to Visionary, how Grace Montgomery rebuilt a billion-dollar empire. But Grace's proudest moment came on a sunny afternoon in Lincoln Park. She was pushing Hope's stroller, watching her daughter giggle at the ducks in the pond. When she saw a woman sitting on a bench, crying, Grace recognized that look, the exhaustion, the fear, the sense of being trapped. "Are you okay?" Grace asked gently. The woman looked up, startled. "I'm fine, just having a hard day. I understand hard days." Grace sat down beside her, Hope babbling happily in the stroller. "I'm Grace. If you need help, if you're in a situation that feels impossible, there are resources, people who will believe you and help you." The woman's eyes filled with fresh tears. "How did you know?" "Because I've been there, and I survived. And so can you." Grace gave the woman Ruby's number at the Hope Foundation hotline. As she walked away, pushing Hope's stroller through the park, she thought about the night she had been thrown onto a rain-soaked street, how certain she had been that her life was over. She thought about her grandfather, a man she barely knew but whose legacy had saved her, about Ben Crawford, who searched for her when no one else cared, about Ruby Mitchell, who believed her when belief was the most radical act of kindness. She thought about the question many people had asked her in interviews: how did you find the strength to fight back? The answer was complicated. Strength was not something you found. It was something you built, piece by piece, in moments when giving up seemed easier. It was recording evidence when you were terrified. It was standing up in court when your voice shook. It was refusing to accept someone else's narrative about who you were. That evening, Grace sat in her grandfather's study, now her study, in the Montgomery estate. She had restored the room to how Howard had kept it, surrounding herself with his books and papers. On the desk was a letter she had found in his files, written to her but never sent. "My dearest Gracie," it read, "if you're reading this, I'm gone, but I hope you know that I never stopped looking for you. Your mother's death devastated me, and losing touch with you has been my greatest regret. I built Montgomery Industries through hard times, through wars and depressions and doubters who said I would fail, but none of that compares to the strength it takes to be a Montgomery woman. Your grandmother survived the depression by feeding neighbors from our garden. Your mother fought addiction and rebuilt her life twice. And you, my girl, carry that same fire. Whatever challenges you face, remember, we bend steel, we don't break. All my love, Grandpa Howard." Grace folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. Then she opened her laptop and began drafting an expansion plan for the Hope Foundation. By next year, she wanted offices in 10 cities, resources for 1,000 women, a network of attorneys like Ben and advocates like Ruby. Derek had tried to erase her. Instead, he had revealed what she was truly capable of. Upstairs, Hope began to cry. Grace closed her laptop and went to her daughter, lifting her from the crib, settling into the rocking chair her grandfather had used for Grace's mother. "Let me tell you a story," Grace whispered to Hope. "Once upon a time, there was a woman who everyone thought was powerless. But she wasn't. She just hadn't realized her strength yet. And when the worst night of her life came, she discovered something important. The people who try to break you are never as strong as they pretend. And you, my darling girl, are stronger than anyone who might try to diminish you. Hope's eyes drooped, comforted by her mother's voice. Grace continued rocking, watching the lights of Chicago glitter through the window, feeling the weight of her daughter in her arms and the weight of an empire on her shoulders. Both felt right, both felt earned. "We survived," Grace whispered to the sleeping baby. "And now we're going to live, really live, on our terms, in our story." Outside, the city hummed with millions of lives, millions of stories. And in one restored mansion in Lake Forest, a new chapter was just beginning. If you or someone you know is experiencing financial abuse or coercion in a relationship, resources are available. You are not alone, you are believed. And you are stronger than you know.